Alright everybody, so I just wanted to cover having a discussion about bolt gap, why it matters, how do you measure it, what are the wear points on the bolt, the rollers, how all that can actually affect your bolt gap. I guess back in the day there were some bolts that were ground in the back and how that would have no real benefit to you in terms of bolt gap and how that's actually measured. So uh, because my barrel's already pressed in, what I'm going to do is kind of give you a breakdown of what dwell time is, why it's important, and I'm going to use an AR-15 barrel Bolton. Um, this is a piece of brass I reload, and so there's no primer, bullet, or anything like that. Think of it as a dummy round. And so I'll take a few minutes and go over what dwell time is and why, if you're having problems with your gun running, it could be because of bolt gap and dwell time. So when a cartridge is in your chamber, you have headspace. When you pull the trigger, firing pins hit. We all understand how that works. There's a mini explosion inside your chamber. The brass expands into the wall of the chamber, creating a seal, and your bullet travels down your barrel. On an AR-15, you have a gas system, right? So depending, it could be piston, it could be DI, it doesn't matter. So what happens is you have gas that is coming, bleeding off through the system, going through your gas tube and hitting your gas key, right? And so if you don't have the gas right, it causes a couple different issues. And so there's the same kind of idea. If you don't have the pressures correct inside your chamber area, and with the bullet coming down, it creates like a pressure drop as soon as the explosion happens. And so what I'm going to talk about is why it's important to make sure you have all that stuff correct. Like on an AR-15, if you see an out of battery fire, you guys see like the bottom of the magazine, it could blow up out through the mag well, and sometimes people get hurt, sometimes people just load another magazine and go away again, and it's pretty amazing to me because I'm surprised they didn't get hurt worse. So this is different than headspace. So I think there's a little bit of confusion about what headspace is compared to what bolt gap is for dwell time and all that kind of stuff. So you could technically have a correct bolt gap and you could not headspace correctly. So let me push this out. So let's say this is the barrel to your Cetme, and the face of your bolt is sitting inside your trunnion and is creating a gap between the face between the face of your carrier and your bolt. And so you could actually have a burned out barrel that the bolt gap could be within spec, and you could have a situation where your gun actually wouldn't be headspace properly, and you could have a catastrophic failure from a headspace problem. So bolt gap and headspace are not the same thing, okay? So when you're measuring headspace, you're actually measuring it off the face of your bolt, the gap between the face of your bolt and inside the chamber. Well, your bullet could be sitting farther inside of your chamber. This guy would still be sitting correctly and you'd have the proper bolt gap, but the gap between your face of your bolt and inside your chamber could be two different things. And so your gun could explode even if you had correct bolt gap in your gun. So bolt gap is just about dwell time. on your system. And so why is that important? Is that well, you could have two things. The rollers could open if you don't have the correct bolt gap. The rollers could open early, and so the rollers, could open up early, and then what you would have is while that explosion's still happening inside your chamber, you have all those gases blowing back into your receiver and possibly into your face, depending on how early you were in the detonation on your uh, ammunition going off, correct? And so uh, if it's had some time for it to be inside the chamber and then it opened a little bit early, maybe you get some gas blow by and you have like your magazine blow out the bottom of your mag well or something like that, and maybe you don't get hurt, but you got lucky. Okay, so that's why bolt gap's super important, is because it's keeping the rollers locked inside the trunnion until the pressures drop inside the chamber long enough for it to be a safe situation for the gun to cycle. So these direct blowback guns, or these roller delayed guns, I should say. I'm sorry, not blowback. Um, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. Is that they're very violent, and so think of this as a big, in a way, it's a big blowback type situation. So with a 308 or a 7.6251, I mean, that's a pretty big round, and you want to make sure that the pressure's dropped inside that chamber before your gun starts cycling open, because if not, then you have all these hot gases blowing inside the receiver. You have an explosion basically inside your receiver versus inside the trunnion, which is designed to hold all the PSI from the explosion happening. And so uh, that is kind of my explanation of bolt gap and the difference between bolt gap and headspace. So that's why I think there's some confusion out there on, is my Cetme or my G3 or any of those roller delayed guns. There's a little bit, I feel like, confusion there between what bolt gap is and what headspace is. So you could have a gun that has correct bolt gap and actually not headspace correctly. Okay, so I'll show you how to check your bolt gap, and I am not going to go into headspace. Mark Novak has really great explanations on what headspace is, how it's measured, and so he's a professional gunsmith. I really highly recommend that, if you join his Patreon and or just check out his channel in general. He has some great explanations. He's a fantastic gunsmith, and so I think you could learn a lot from his channel in that aspect. So but I just wanted to go over kind of a high overview of what headspace is, what dwell time is, what bolt gap is, why it's important, and so we can kind of go into that. So on a Cetme or any other roller delayed type gun, the rollers, they wear inside here, right? And so uh, you could change out your bolt, not your rollers, and change your bolt gap. So where these guys are coming out at could be moving forward or backward depending on the wear of the bolt and how much it's been used. Some of these kits, these guns are like brand new, and some of them have been well used. So uh, that would be a place to look. Your ejector protrudes, or I'm sorry, not your ejector. Yeah, and so actually you could have it could be worn, and you could actually have a bolt gap that shrinks because of that. So you could replace that, and that actually solve maybe your bolt gap. So it isn't necessarily always go straight to the rollers, okay? the rollers are only one piece of this whole situation, and so firing pin protrusion could possibly even change that a little bit as well. So uh, just take that into an account. You don't always have to go right for the rollers. You might have actually a worn bolt, a worn trunnion. And so those are just some things to think about in terms of what's causing my bolt gap issues. Could be multiple things. Okay, you could change the rollers and not necessarily change your problem. Okay, so that's kind of my explanation or high overview, a level in terms of that. So let's go ahead and put the gun back together, and I'll show you how to measure bolt gap. Let me grab my feeler gauges real quick. I forgot them. So if you look at your Sammy spec, this is a perfect example. The average uh, headspace clearance on Sammy, I haven't looked up 308 or anything yet, but it's probably only like 10 thousandths. And the range on a bolt gap on a Cetme is 4 thousandths to 20 thousandths. So that should just explain right there. Well, if you have a gun that's gapping at 17 thousandths, you would technically be outside of headspace if that was actually the headspace of the gun. So I don't know if that might clear up some of your confusion between the two, but it's just something that I think people should be aware of. And so let's just go on ahead and check bolt gap. So I know where my gun bolt gap is at. It's actually sitting at right about 10 thousandths. So make sure that your feeler gauge is nice and clean. So you see how I just wipe that off? Honestly, like using some alcohol or brake parts cleaner might not be a bad idea. I would tear your bolt apart and make sure it's super clean. I'm not necessarily going to do that in this video here, okay? So take your bolt apart, make sure that's clean, because if there's crud or this gun's been shot quite a bit, so you can see how dirty that bolt was and everything. It's going to possibly make your readings wrong, bigger, smaller, who knows. So just make sure that everything's super clean when you're doing this. So you can see the rollers are open at this moment, right there, or the bolt's open. When you push all that in, you're going to see that gap close. Well, if I can get it to close here. There we go. Okay. So you can see here there's a little bit of a gap in there. So just so you can see it, I'm going to just show you for now. So you can see here that my 10 thousandths gauge goes in. It has a little bit it's not hard to push in. It's just got enough, just enough. Okay, so it shouldn't be super hard. It should be just barely dragging. If any of you are mechanics or anything like that, think of it if like you did a valve job, you grinded some valves or something like that, and you're just checking the clearance after you do that. Same kind of feel. Shouldn't have to force it in. If you are forcing it in, that's not going to be the correct gap. You're probably 1 thousandths or 2 thousandths higher than what you should be. So that's how you measure the gap. I would do it while the gun's together. One of the other things that can cause your bolt gap to be different too is how worn is your spring. So if any of this system's worn, you could replace this and that could change your bolt cap. So um, just food for thought on all that. So I don't have any ammunition or anything on the table. As you can see, I don't have a magazine or anything like that. Check it, make sure your stuff's all good to go. Pull the trigger. The hammer closing on that's just holding everything tight, okay? Find the whatever feeler gauge between 4 thousandths and 20 thousandths. Push her down in there. It should just be barely in there, okay? And then you know that you have the proper bolt gap. And so after you initially do all this, your bolt gap could actually shrink. So after you put your gun together, so I don't know if you can hear, it's a little dirty in there, but oh, I don't know if you can hear that or not. But so after you first build your Cetme, shoot like 200 rounds through it and check your bolt gap again. So as everything compresses and expands, metals change. So double check it after a couple hundred rounds after your build. That's how you check your bolt gap. Try to give you a high overview of what dwell time is. So basically, as your bullet's coming down the barrel, there's pressure going two ways, remember? So when you have an explosion inside a chamber, it's pushing back on the bolt face while the bullet's heading down. There's no bleed off on any of this stuff like an AR-15 or any DI gun or gas piston gun or anything like that. And so you have basically a lot of pressure coming back into this system. That's why they eject so fiercely. And so just make sure that your bolt gap is correct. And if you have one of the older guns that has a grinded bolt on it, just replace the bolt. I wouldn't trust like that whole add 18 thousandths or minus 18 thousandths or whatever they would grind off those things to make the bolt gap correct. Apex Gun Parts still has them in stock, so just buy a new one and put it in, and you don't have to worry about it. So that's the last piece on like the build series that I had on this. So when you're welding your trunnion in, my last thing I guess, I seen somebody made a really good point on one of the forums, and it was if you're using a welder that might be a little underpowered, heat your trunnion up with like a propane torch or something like that, because it will help get your filler to adhere in there. So you could have a smaller machine, heat that up with a welder, and then when you're welding your plug weld, start in the center, let the filler flow into the rest of it, and you'll have a good adhesion to the trunnion on your weld, and your plug weld will be correct then. So hope this helps you. Message me if you need anything or have any questions. Have a good one.